She was just a cleanin' lady, humiliated, ignored, no one took her seriously, but no one knew her secret. And tonight, she's gonna change everything. Watch to the end to see how power changes the owner in the most unexpected ways. Subscribe and let me know what you think in the comments. The early morning rush filled the corporate headquarters of BuzzTech, a once powerful tech company now teetering on the edge of collapse. Employees hurried through the sleek hallways, coffee cups in hand, murmuring about upcoming meetings and quarterly reports. Among them, unnoticed and invisible, moved Clara Sanders. Clad in a janitor's uniform, she pushed her mop and bucket along the pristine marble floor, her movements slow and deliberate. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind was anything but idle. She was listening, observing, and memorizing every detail. Clara had owned this company for 2 months. It had been a strategic acquisition, a move that many in the industry had deemed foolish. BuzzTech was a sinking ship, plagued by mismanagement, reckless spending, and an entrenched toxic work culture. But Clara saw potential where others saw failure. She knew that saving the company required more than just new policies and financial restructuring. She needed to understand what had rotted beneath the surface, and the only way to do that was to embed herself where no one would expect. For the past 2 weeks, she had lived the life of a janitor, cleaning floors, scrubbing desks, and emptying trash cans while she quietly studied the inner workings of her new company. What she discovered was worse than she had anticipated. Employees at the top viewed those below them as expendable. The executives had created an atmosphere of fear, using layoffs as a tool to maximize profits without consideration for the long-term health of the company. Worst of all, the very foundation of BuzzTech, the employees who worked tirelessly behind the scenes, were undervalued, mistreated, and completely ignored. As she moved through the halls that morning, she overheard a group of mid-level managers conversing in hushed but urgent tones near the conference room. Clara pretended to mop the floor nearby, keeping her head down as she listened. "I heard the layoffs are coming sooner than expected," one of them whispered. 20% of staff is on the chopping block, another added, mostly lower-level employees. Admins, IT support, janitors. Clara's grip on the mop tightened. She had anticipated this, but hearing it confirmed what she had already suspected. These people had no real strategy for saving the company, only desperation. A loud, arrogant laugh erupted from inside the conference room, drawing her attention. Mark Hastings, one of the senior managers, leaned back in his chair, smirking as he spoke. "I don't know why we keep so many janitors around anyway," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "They don't do much. Half the time they're just standing around. We could probably get rid of most of them and no one would even notice." A few of the other executives chuckled in agreement. Clara remained impassive, continuing to clean as though she hadn't heard a word. But inside, she memorized their faces, their tones, and their words. Later in the day, during her break, Clara sat in the employee lounge, quietly sipping her coffee from a chipped mug. She kept to herself as usual, blending into the background while others gossiped. "Did you see that new janitor?" Jennifer, an administrative assistant, said to her friends, laughing. "She's so quiet. I bet she doesn't even speak English." More laughter followed. Clara kept her expression neutral, pretending not to hear. It wasn't the insults that bothered her. She had faced worse in her life, but rather the ease with which these people dehumanized those they considered beneath them. No one challenged Jennifer's remark. No one defended the janitor they so easily mocked. The culture of silence and complicity was the real disease infecting BuzzTech. She had seen enough. The executives viewed their employees as numbers on a spreadsheet, and the employees accepted mistreatment as the status quo. But Clara was here to disrupt that status quo. As she walked down the hallway later that evening, the office nearly empty, she paused outside the CEO's office. The brass nameplate on the door still bore the name of the previous owner. Soon, that would change. Soon, the very people who dismissed her as nothing would learn the truth. For now, she had to be patient. Change didn't happen overnight. It required planning, strategy, and the perfect moment. But Clara had always been a master of patience. She turned away from the office, her grip tightening around the mop handle as she continued her shift. They wouldn't see the storm coming. They never did. Clara moved through the office halls with the same measured steps she had practiced for weeks. She had become an expert at blending in, at making herself invisible to the very people who controlled this company's fate. Each day she endured the casual dismissiveness, the superiority, the constant reminders that to these people she was nothing more than a janitor. But she wasn't here to react. She was here to understand. She had spent enough time in the industry to recognize a company on the brink of disaster. The signs were all here: low morale, uncertainty in employees' eyes, a suffocating fear of job cuts. The atmosphere in BuzzTech was thick with anxiety. Rumors of layoffs circulated faster than facts. The executives, rather than finding innovative ways to fix the company, chose the easiest solution: cut costs by eliminating people. At midday, as Clara pushed her cleaning cart into the employee lounge, she caught sight of Jennifer again. The administrative assistant leaned against the counter, speaking to a group of co-workers. Clara took her time refilling the coffee station, pretending to be absorbed in the task. "I heard the layoffs are coming soon," Jennifer said, stirring sugar into her coffee. "I bet half the janitors will be gone. It's not like we need so many of them." Another woman nodded. "Honestly, I don't get why they keep them at all. Cleaning isn't that hard." Clara tightened her grip on the counter but remained silent. She had already heard versions of this conversation before. People like Jennifer didn't just dislike janitors, they dismissed their existence entirely. "Speaking of which, have you noticed the new one?" Jennifer gestured vaguely in Clara's direction, lowering her voice but making sure it was still loud enough to be heard. "She's always so quiet. I swear she never says a word. Probably doesn't even understand us." Laughter followed. Clara turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at Jennifer. The woman's smug smile, the way her eyes gleamed with self-satisfaction, it told Clara everything she needed to know. She had spent years fighting to be recognized in boardrooms filled with people who judged her first by her skin, then by her gender, and only last by her intelligence. This was nothing new, but that didn't make it any less disappointing. Later in the afternoon, Clara was called into one of the executive conference rooms to clean. She moved methodically, ensuring every surface was spotless. As she worked, Mark Hastings entered the room, speaking into his phone. "Yes, I know it's unfortunate, but the layoffs are necessary," he said, walking to the window. "No, I don't care how long they've been here. We need to cut at least 20% to make it look like we're making progress." Clara kept her head down, wiping the table near where he stood. He barely glanced at her. "I don't care if people complain. These are low-level employees. It's not like we're firing the real talent," he continued, "and don't get me started on the janitorial staff. They walk around like they own the place, but half of them barely work." Clara inhaled slowly, pushing down the anger bubbling inside her. If only he knew. That evening, as the office emptied out, Clara took the long route back to the janitorial closet. She passed rows of empty desks, each one belonging to someone who feared they'd lose their job tomorrow. She thought about the conversations she had overheard, about the laughter, the dismissiveness, the utter disregard for the people who kept this company running. Change was coming. She just had to wait for the right moment. The conference room buzzed with conversation as the executives gathered, their voices low and urgent. Clara entered quietly, pushing her cleaning cart to the side as if she were just another unnoticed presence in the room. It was a familiar routine by now, watching, listening, waiting. Today, however, would be different. Today, she would no longer remain in the background. Mark Hastings stood near the head of the table, his usual self-satisfied smirk firmly in place. "We can't avoid this any longer," he declared, his voice carrying through the room. "Layoffs need to happen now. 20% of the staff, minimum. Start with the admin teams, IT support, and—" he gestured vaguely. "Janitors, obviously." A few executives exchanged glances, but no one challenged him. Clara observed their silent compliance, their unwillingness to push back against the inevitable. She had seen this kind of cowardice before, people too afraid to disrupt the status quo, even when they knew it was wrong. "We need to move fast," another executive added. "If we announce this strategically, we can spin it as necessary restructuring rather than desperation." Clara took a deep breath and let go of the mop handle. Her pulse was steady. The time for patience was over. She walked toward the head of the table, where Richard Owens, the CEO, sat flipping through reports. No one paid attention to her until she stopped directly beside him. "I think we need to reconsider," she said evenly. The room fell into silence. Owens blinked up at her, confusion flickering in his expression. "Excuse me?" Across the table, Hastings frowned. "What the hell are you doing here?" Clara met his gaze without hesitation. "I'm here because this conversation affects the future of BuzzTech, and I happen to have a say in that future." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. Some of the executives exchanged bewildered looks. Hastings scoffed. "Oh, really? And why exactly should we care what a janitor thinks?" Clara reached into her pocket and pulled out a slim envelope. She placed it in front of Owens, who hesitated before opening it. His expression shifted instantly. First confusion, then shock, then pale recognition. This can't be right," Owens stammered, scanning the documents again as if hoping they would change. Clara clasped her hands behind her back. "It's very right." Owens swallowed hard and looked up at her. "I own BuzzTech," she finished for him. "I've owned it for the last 2 months." The room erupted into stunned exclamations. Some executives leaned forward in their chairs, their expressions shifting between disbelief and panic. Hastings, however, remained standing, his face turning an angry shade of red. "This is a joke," he spat. "You expect us to believe that you, a janitor, bought this company?" Clara turned to face him directly. "I expect you to believe what's written in those documents," she said coolly. "And as of today, I'm making the decisions that will determine BuzzTech's future." The tension in the room was suffocating. No one moved. No one spoke. The power dynamic had shifted in an instant, and the people who had spent weeks ignoring her now hung on to her every word. Clara let the silence stretch just long enough before delivering her final statement. "This company doesn't need layoffs," she said. "It needs leadership, and starting now, it's going to have it." The weight of Clara's words settled over the conference room like a thick, suffocating fog. Every executive at the table sat frozen, eyes darting between her and the documents in Richard Owens' trembling hands. The realization that the woman they had dismissed for weeks as nothing more than a janitor was, in fact, the owner of BuzzTech sent a wave of unease through the room. Hastings was the first to break the silence, his chair scraping against the polished floor as he pushed himself up. His face was a mixture of disbelief and anger, his fists clenching at his sides. "This is absurd," he spat, voice trembling with barely contained rage. "There is no way in hell that this company belongs to you. You're lying. This is some ridiculous stunt." "I don't waste my time on stunts," Clara interrupted, her voice as steady as ever. She took a step forward, meeting his glare with a calm intensity. "The documents are real. The shares are real. The power you think you have in this room is an illusion, Hastings." Hastings let out a sharp breath, shaking his head in disbelief. "This isn't how things work. You can't just waltz in here and take control like some kind of what?" Clara asked, raising a single brow. The tension in the air thickened, her words daring him to finish his sentence. He hesitated, his jaw tightening. For the first time since she had arrived in BuzzTech, he looked unsure. Owens cleared his throat, his voice weak. "Miss Sanders, I don't understand. If you've owned the company for 2 months, why would I disguise myself as a janitor?" Clara finished for him, tilting her head slightly. She let her gaze sweep across the room, taking in the nervous faces of the people who had ignored her existence just hours ago. Because numbers on a spreadsheet don't tell the full story of a company. Because I needed to see firsthand how BuzzTech really operates. And because what I found was worse than I imagined. The executives shifted uncomfortably. A few glanced down at their papers as if avoiding her eyes might make them disappear. Hastings, however, was far from finished. He scoffed, his expression twisting with something almost desperate. "So what? You think just because you saw things, you know how to fix them? You're going to what? Fire everyone and play hero?" Clara exhaled through her nose, feeling the burn of restrained anger in her chest. "No, Hastings, but I am going to start with you." Silence crashed over the room. Hastings blinked. A nervous chuckle slipped past his lips. "You can't be serious." Clara turned her attention to Owens. "His termination papers are ready, I assume?" Owens looked as though he had swallowed glass, but he gave a slow nod. "Yes, they've been prepared." Hastings turned on him. "Are you kidding me?" He pointed a shaking finger at Clara. "You're really going to listen to her?" "She's the owner," Owens said simply, his voice filled with something resembling reluctant defeat. The security guards standing by the door, men Hastings had barely acknowledged earlier, took a step forward. Clara nodded in their direction. "Escort Mr. Hastings out of the building." Hastings' eyes darted around the room, searching for support, but none of the executives spoke up for him. The realization that no one was coming to his defense settled on his face like a slow, creeping horror. "You'll regret this," he snarled, his voice losing its edge. "You think you can just walk in here and undo years of work? This company will crash and burn without me. This company has been burning for a long time," Clara cut in, "and you've been feeding the flames." The guards took him by the arms, and though he struggled at first, Hastings ultimately had no choice but to comply. As he was led toward the door, he cast one last venomous glare at Clara. "You don't belong here," he hissed under his breath. Clara didn't flinch. She simply watched as he was escorted from the room, his voice echoing down the hallway before being swallowed by the closing doors. She turned back to the executives. Their faces were pale, their postures rigid. She had their attention now. "Anyone else care to challenge my authority?" she asked, arching a brow. No one spoke. She nodded slowly. "Good. Then let's talk about the future of this company." A few hesitant glances were exchanged, but no one dared to argue. Clara stepped towards the head of the table and placed both hands on its sleek surface. "BuzzTech has been in free fall for months," she said, "and every decision made in this room has only made it worse. You think the solution is mass layoffs? Cutting the people who actually keep this company running? That's not leadership, that's cowardice." One of the executives, a woman named Evelyn Clark, adjusted her glasses. "If we don't cut costs, we won't survive," she said, though her voice was far less confident than before. Clara studied her for a moment. "Then let's talk about where the real waste is." She turned to Owens. "How much is the executive retreat next month costing?" Owens hesitated. Around $6 million. A murmur of discomfort rippled through the room. Clara nodded. $6 million for a weekend of golf and overpriced catering while you're planning to fire the people who clean this building, who answer phones, who process the work that keeps the company afloat? More shifting in chairs. Evelyn swallowed hard. "That's how things have always been done." Clara leaned back. "Then it's time for change." She outlined the first steps, eliminating executive excess, cutting the bloated marketing budgets that had yielded no returns, and refocusing resources on innovation instead of quick fixes. One by one, the executives began nodding. Some were hesitant, others wary, but they all understood one thing. Clara wasn't just here to replace faces at the top. She was here to rebuild everything from the ground up. By the end of the meeting, the energy in the room had shifted. The people who had once dismissed her now listened. The ones who had ignored her presence now hung on to her every word. The toxic culture that had ruled BuzzTech for years wouldn't disappear overnight. But it would start today. As Clara stepped out of the boardroom, the hallway felt different. The weight of what she had done settled on her shoulders, but she welcomed it. She had endured their insults. She had listened to their arrogance. And now she was the one in control. She had work to do. The tension inside BuzzTech's headquarters had shifted. The weight of uncertainty that once loomed over the employees had begun to lift, replaced with cautious optimism. Word spread quickly about the changes Clara had set in motion. Some executives had already packed their offices, quietly accepting their fate. Others, who had chosen to stay, knew they had to adapt or risk the same fate as Mark Hastings. The power structure of BuzzTech was no longer dictated by arrogance and self-preservation. Clara had made sure of that. Walking through the halls now, she could feel the difference. The employees no longer avoided eye contact out of fear. They no longer whispered anxiously about impending layoffs. Instead, there was an unspoken understanding. Things were changing. And for the first time in a long while, change did not mean destruction. Clara stepped into her new office, the one that had previously belonged to Richard Owens. The brass nameplate had already been removed, leaving a blank space where her name would soon be engraved. She ran a hand over the polished desk, the weight of the past few weeks settling in. She had fought for this moment, endured the humiliation and disrespect to see this company from the ground level, and now she had the opportunity to rebuild it properly. A soft knock at the door drew her attention. A young woman, dressed in the navy blue uniform of the janitorial staff, hesitated in the doorway. Her hands fidgeted nervously at her sides as she stepped forward. "Miss Sanders," she said hesitantly, I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done." Clara tilted her head slightly, studying the woman who, just a few weeks ago, might have been in her position, overlooked and unheard. "You don't have to thank me," Clara replied, offering a small smile. "I'm just doing what should have been done a long time ago." The young woman's lips pressed together, her expression uncertain. "It's just, I've never worked anywhere where people like me mattered," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I always thought we were just here." Clara let out a slow breath, nodding. "Not anymore." The young woman smiled, nodded, and exited, leaving Clara alone in the office once more. Clara sank into the chair behind the desk, staring out the wide glass window overlooking the city skyline. This was just the beginning. There were still deep-seated issues within the company that needed to be addressed, policies that needed to change, trust that needed to be rebuilt. It wouldn't be easy, and she knew there would be resistance. But she had never shied away from a fight. She reached for the first of many files stacked neatly in front of her, flipping it open as she settled in. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, BuzzTech had a future worth working toward, and this time, no one would be left behind. Justice has been served, and Clara has taken her rightful place. But what would you do in her position? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more incredible stories. See you in the next one.